They say blood is thicker than water, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes that blood can poison everything it touches. My name is Eleanor, and at 6 to 7 years old, I thought I knew everything about betrayal. I was wrong. Dead wrong. If you're watching this from your living room, your car, or wherever you find yourself right now, I want you to leave a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. Because what I'm about to share with you happened in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio, but the pain, the raw, devastating pain of family betrayal, that's universal. And if you've ever felt the sting of being used by the people you love most, then you need to hear this story. Before I go any further, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Not because I'm asking for meaningless numbers, but because stories like mine, stories of women who refuse to be walked on, who fight back when the world expects them to just take it, these stories matter. They need to be heard. And there are more stories like this in the description box below that will remind you that you're not alone in this world. It was a Tuesday evening in March when my world crumbled and rebuilt itself all in the span of 30 seconds. I was tucking my 8-year-old granddaughter, Sophie, into her princess-themed bed, the same bed I'd bought her for her 6th birthday because my daughter Jessica claimed they couldn't afford it. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the heating system I'd also paid to repair just last winter. Sophie's room smelled like lavender from the pillow spray I'd brought over, mixed with that sweet scent that only children seem to carry. Her blonde hair was spread across the pillow like spun gold, and those big blue eyes, my late husband Richard's eyes, stared up at me with an innocence that made my heart ache. "Grandma Eleanor," she whispered, her small hand gripping mine with surprising strength. "I need to tell you something, but you can't tell Mommy and Daddy I said it." I smoothed her hair back, the way I used to do with Jessica when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. "What is it, sweetheart? You can tell Grandma anything." Sophie's eyes darted toward her bedroom door, then back to me. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper, and I had to lean in close to hear her words. What she said next shattered my world into a million pieces. "Grandma, they traveled to take all your inheritance." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs, felt the room spin slightly around me. My hand, still stroking Sophie's hair, froze mid-motion. "What did you say, honey?" I managed to whisper back, though every instinct screamed that I'd heard her correctly the first time. "Mommy and Daddy went on their vacation to meet with lawyers about getting your money when you die," Sophie continued, her innocent voice delivering each word like a dagger to my chest. "I heard them talking on the phone before they left. Daddy said something about making sure the will gets changed, and Mommy was crying, but not the sad kind of crying. The happy kind." I sat there on the edge of that little bed, staring into my granddaughter's trusting eyes, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest where my heart used to be. 20 years of widowhood. 20 years of putting my daughter and her family first. 20 years of sacrificing, of giving, of believing that love was unconditional and family meant forever. All of it, every birthday check, every mortgage payment I'd helped with, every time I'd said yes when they needed money for Sophie's school clothes or their car repairs or their dream vacation, all of it had been leading to this moment. This betrayal that cut so deep I could taste blood in my mouth. You see, I'd spent the last 5 days being their live-in housekeeper and babysitter while Jessica and her husband, David, took what they called a much-needed romantic getaway to California. I'd arrived at their house in the suburbs of Columbus last Saturday morning with my arms full of groceries and my heart full of love, ready to spoil my granddaughter and give the young couple a break. But as I sat there in Sophie's room, the truth washing over me like ice water, I realized I hadn't been invited to help. I'd been strategically positioned, kept busy and distracted while they flew across the country to systematically dismantle the life I'd built, the security I'd earned, the legacy I'd planned to leave. The inheritance Sophie mentioned wasn't small change. Richard and I had been careful with money our entire marriage. We'd invested wisely, saved religiously, and when he died 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack, he'd left me with assets worth just over $2 million. The house we'd bought in 1982 and paid off early. The rental properties we'd acquired. The retirement accounts, the life insurance policies, the carefully curated stock portfolio. It was money I'd planned to enjoy in my golden years, money I'd hoped would provide security for Sophie's education, money that represented 45 years of marriage and sacrifice and partnership. Money that Jessica knew about because I'd been stupid enough to be transparent about my finances, believing that honesty and trust were the foundations of family love. Sophie's breathing had evened out, and I realized she'd fallen asleep while I sat there processing the destruction of everything I'd believed about my own daughter. I kissed her forehead gently, breathing in that sweet child scent one more time before I stood up on shaking legs. As I walked down the hallway of their 4-bedroom house, the house I'd co-signed for because their credit wasn't quite good enough, the house where I'd spent countless evenings babysitting and helping with homework and making meals, I felt something shift inside me. The grief was still there, raw and bleeding. But underneath it, something else was growing. Something harder, colder, more determined. I went to their kitchen, poured myself a glass of water from the refrigerator I'd helped them buy, and sat at the table where I'd shared thousands of meals with this family I'd loved more than my own life. The house was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock in the living room, another gift from me, ticking away the seconds. They thought they were so clever, sending me away to play grandmother while they plotted to take everything Richard and I had worked for. They thought I was just a lonely old widow, desperate for family connection and too naive to see what was happening right in front of me. They were wrong. I pulled out my phone and checked the time, 9:47 p.m. Jessica and David weren't due back until Friday evening. That gave me almost 4 full days to do what needed to be done. 4 days to protect what was mine and ensure that my granddaughter would never grow up thinking that this kind of betrayal was normal or acceptable in a family. I'd lived through my husband's death. I'd survived the loneliness, the grief, the complete reorganization of a life I'd shared with someone else for decades. I'd learned to be strong in ways I never imagined I'd need to be strong. But this betrayal from my own child, was going to require a different kind of strength. The kind of strength that comes from righteous anger. The kind of strength that turns grandmothers into warriors. That night, as I lay in their guest bedroom staring at the ceiling fan I'd paid to have installed, I began to make my plan. It was a plan born of hurt and sharpened by determination. A plan that would ensure Jessica and David learned what it really meant to underestimate Eleanor Catherine Mitchell. And when they came back from their inheritance-stealing vacation, what they found waiting for them would leave them in complete and total surprise. The game had changed. They just didn't know it yet. The morning after Sophie's revelation, I woke before dawn with the kind of clarity that only comes from having your world completely rearranged in the span of 30 seconds. The guest bedroom felt different now, not like a welcoming space for a beloved family member, but like a stage where I'd been performing the role of the grateful grandmother while my own daughter orchestrated my financial funeral. I made coffee in their kitchen using the expensive machine I'd bought them last Christmas, and as the sun painted their backyard gold through windows I'd helped them upgrade just 6 months ago, I began to see the architecture of their betrayal with stunning precision. It hadn't happened overnight. This had been planned, calculated, executed with the kind of cold precision that made my blood run ice cold in my veins. I thought back to all the conversations over the past year that I'd dismissed as loving concern. Jessica's gentle suggestions that I was getting older and might want to simplify my financial situation. David's casual questions about my estate planning, disguised as son-in-law worry about making sure I had everything properly organized. Their sudden interest in my health, their insistence on accompanying me to doctor's appointments, their careful attention to every detail of my daily life. If you've ever had family members start treating you differently as you age, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That subtle shift from seeing you as a person to seeing you as an asset to be managed. Comment below if you've experienced this, because I need you to know you're not alone in recognizing these warning signs. What hurt most was remembering how grateful I'd been for their attention. How touched I'd felt when Jessica started calling more frequently, when David began asking detailed questions about my finances under the guise of making sure I wasn't being taken advantage of by anyone else. The irony was so bitter it made my stomach turn. I pulled out my laptop. Yes, despite what my daughter apparently thought, this 6-to-7-year-old woman was perfectly capable of using technology, and began to review my financial records with the kind of scrutiny I should have applied to my daughter's motives months ago. The pattern was undeniable once I knew to look for it. Every major expense Jessica and David had asked me to help with over the past year had been preceded by careful conversations about my financial situation. The roof repair that had cost me $18,000. The new car down payment that had been another $15,000. Sophie's private school tuition that I'd agreed to cover for the entire year at $22,000. They hadn't just been bleeding me dry, they'd been conducting research, learning exactly how much I had, where it was kept, how it was structured. Information they were now using to steal it all from 3,000 miles away while I played babysitter in their home. But here's what Jessica had forgotten in her careful manipulation of her aging mother. I might be 6 to 7 years old, but I'd spent 45 years married to a man who'd built a successful accounting firm from nothing. I'd been his partner in every sense of the word, including his business partner. I understood money, investments, legal structures, and financial planning better than most people half my age. And I understood revenge. The grandfather clock in the living room chimed 7 times as I made my first phone call. My attorney, William Harper, had been Richard's best friend since college and had handled all our legal affairs for over 30 years. When he answered on the second ring, his voice was warm with genuine affection. "Eleanor, what a pleasant surprise. How are you holding up, dear?" "I'm about to find out, William," I said, settling into the leather chair that David had specifically requested I buy for their living room. "I need to know everything about inheritance law in Ohio, and I need to know it today." There was a pause. William had known me long enough to recognize the steel in my voice when I meant business. "Is everything all right? Has something happened with Jessica?" "Something has happened with Jessica," I confirmed, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "She's currently in California with David, meeting with lawyers to figure out how to get their hands on my inheritance before I'm dead to leave it to them." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. "Eleanor," William's voice was careful, professional now. "Are you certain about this information?" "My granddaughter overheard them discussing it. An 8-year-old doesn't lie about something like that, William. She doesn't even understand what it really means." "Jesus," he breathed, and I knew he was thinking about his own children, his own grandchildren. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry. What do you need from me?" "I need to know my options. All of them. Legal, practical, and otherwise. And I need to know them before Jessica and David return from their little planning trip on Friday evening." What William told me over the next hour filled me with both relief and renewed determination. Ohio law was very clear about inheritance rights, and despite whatever schemes my daughter and son-in-law were cooking up in California, there were limits to what they could accomplish without my direct involvement. But there were also loopholes. Gray areas. Ways that unscrupulous adult children had successfully manipulated aging parents into signing away their security. The conversation was a masterclass in the vulnerability of older adults, even those who thought they were too smart and too careful to be taken advantage of. "The good news," William explained, "is that your estate planning is rock solid. Richard made sure of that, and we've updated everything appropriately since his death. They can't just wave a magic wand and make themselves your heirs." "And the bad news?" "The bad news is that if they've been planning this systematically, they may be building a case for financial guardianship or competency issues. If they can convince a court that you're not capable of managing your own affairs." He didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood exactly what he was saying. After I hung up with William, I made my second call of the day. My longtime friend Margaret, who'd been Richard's secretary for 20 years before she retired, answered with her characteristic warmth. "Eleanor, how lovely to hear from you. How's the grandmothering going?" "Margaret, I need a favor. A big one." "Anything, dear. You know that. I need you to make some phone calls for me. Discreet inquiries. I need to know if Jessica and David have been contacting any lawyers in California, specifically estate planning attorneys or elder law specialists." There was a sharp intake of breath. "Oh, honey, no. Oh, yes. And I need to know exactly what they've been telling these lawyers about my mental capacity, my financial management skills, and my susceptibility to outside influence." Margaret had spent 2 decades managing Richard's client relationships, which meant she had a network of contacts in legal and financial services that spanned 3 states. If anyone could find out what Jessica and David were up to, it was Margaret. "Give me until this evening," she said, her voice sharp with the same righteous anger I was feeling. "I'll find out everything." My third call was the hardest one to make. I dialed my brother Robert in Phoenix, the brother I hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years because of a stupid argument about Richard's funeral arrangements. Pride is a luxury I could no longer afford. "Ellie." His voice was shocked, uncertain. "Robert, I need help." The story poured out of me in a rush of words and barely contained fury. I told him about Sophie's revelation, about the pattern of manipulation I'd finally recognized, about the phone calls I'd made that morning. Robert listened without interruption, and when I finished, the silence stretched between us like a bridge I wasn't sure he'd cross. "Those bastards," he finally said, his voice tight with protective anger that reminded me why I'd adored my big brother when we were children. "Ellie, what do you need?" "I need you to make some calls to your lawyer friends in California. I need to know if Jessica and David have been lawyer shopping, and I need to know what they've been telling people about my situation. Consider it done. But Ellie, I want you to know something else. Whatever you're planning, and I know you well enough to know you're planning something, I'm behind you 100%. That girl needs to learn what happens when you betray family. After I hung up with Robert, I sat in Jessica's living room looking around at all the evidence of my own generosity. The furniture I'd helped them buy, the electronics I'd gifted them, the artwork on the walls that I'd selected and paid for because I'd wanted their house to be beautiful for Sophie to grow up in. They'd turned my love into a weapon against me. Every gift, every gesture of support, every demonstration of my financial stability had been catalogued and analyzed and ultimately used to justify stealing everything Richard and I had worked for. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation in their careful planning. They'd underestimated what a woman with nothing left to lose was capable of accomplishing in 4 days. By Wednesday morning, the pieces of Jessica and David's betrayal were falling into place with sickening clarity. Margaret had called me back the previous evening with information that made my stomach clench with fury and my heart break all over again. "Eleanor, honey, sit down," Margaret had said, her voice heavy with the kind of sympathy that precedes devastating news. They'd been busy in California. Very busy. Margaret's contacts had confirmed that Jessica and David had consulted with 3 different estate planning attorneys in Los Angeles, telling each of them a carefully crafted story about an aging mother whose judgment was declining, whose finances were becoming disorganized, and whose vulnerability to scams and poor decisions was increasing by the day. They'd painted me as a woman so lonely and desperate for attention that I was throwing money at anyone who showed me kindness. They'd described incidents of confusion and memory lapses that had never happened, financial decisions that had never been made, and concerning behaviors that existed only in their imagination. If you've ever been misrepresented by people who are supposed to love you, you understand the particular kind of violation I was feeling. It's not just betrayal, it's the theft of your very identity, your dignity, your truth. Drop a comment if you've experienced this kind of gaslighting from family members, because I want you to know that your experience is valid and you're not alone. But Margaret had also uncovered something else. Jessica and David weren't just planning to steal my inheritance. They were planning to have me declared incompetent. The legal strategy they'd been discussing with these California attorneys was complex but devastatingly effective if executed properly. First, they would establish a pattern of concerning behavior and poor judgment on my part. Then they would petition for guardianship based on my alleged inability to manage my own affairs. Once they had legal control over my finances, transferring my assets to themselves would be a simple matter of paperwork. It was brilliant. It was systematic. It was absolutely ruthless in its calculation. And it was about to backfire spectacularly. My brother Robert called that same evening with his own intelligence-gathering results. Not only had Jessica and David been meeting with attorneys, but they'd also been consulting with a private investigator who specialized in documenting the declining mental capacity of elderly individuals. "Ellie, they're building a case against you," Robert had said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "They've got this PI looking into your recent financial transactions, your social interactions, your daily routines. They're looking for anything they can twist into evidence of incompetence." The audacity of it was breathtaking. While I was lovingly caring for their child, they were 3,000 miles away constructing an elaborate fiction about my mental decline, hiring professionals to help them steal everything I owned. But Robert had also given me the name of the private investigator they'd hired, Thomas Chen, a former police detective who'd built a lucrative business helping adult children prove their parents were unfit to manage their own money. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I called Thomas Chen directly. "Mr. Chen, my name is Eleanor Mitchell, and I understand you've been hired by my daughter Jessica and her husband David to investigate my mental capacity and financial judgment." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. "Mrs. Mitchell," he finally said, his voice carefully neutral, "I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to." "Oh, I think you understand perfectly," I replied, settling back in the chair I'd bought for their living room. "I'm calling because I'd like to hire you myself. I'm willing to pay twice whatever my daughter is paying you, and I suspect you'll find the real situation much more interesting than whatever story she's been telling you." Another long pause. I could practically hear him calculating. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'd need to see some kind of verification that you're capable of making this kind of decision." I laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Mr. Chen, I'm sitting in my daughter's house, where I'm babysitting my granddaughter while they're in California meeting with attorneys about stealing my inheritance. I've spent the last 2 days documenting every lie they've told you, every manipulation they've orchestrated, and every dollar they've extracted from me under false pretenses over the past year. Does that sound like the behavior of an incompetent woman to you? Jesus, he breathed. Exactly. So, Mr. Chen, are you interested in earning twice your current fee to investigate the people who are actually committing fraud in this situation? What Thomas Chen told me over the next hour was both horrifying and invaluable. Jessica and David had provided him with a detailed timeline of alleged incidents that painted me as increasingly confused, financially irresponsible, and susceptible to manipulation. They'd claimed I'd given large sums of money to telemarketers, that I'd made impulsive purchases I couldn't remember, that I'd forgotten to pay bills and then become agitated when reminded. Every single incident they'd reported was completely fabricated. But more importantly, Thomas had been documenting Jessica and David's own behavior throughout this process, and what he'd observed was a textbook case of financial elder abuse in the planning stages. Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to know that in 20 years of doing this work, I've never seen a case quite this calculated. Your daughter and her husband aren't just opportunistic, they're sophisticated in their approach. This isn't a spur-of-the-moment decision to take advantage of an aging parent. This is a long-term strategic plan that they've been executing for months. Thomas agreed to switch sides, but he also gave me something more valuable than his investigative services. He gave me insight into just how deep this betrayal went. Jessica and David had been laying groundwork for this theft for almost a year. The increased attention, the concerned phone calls, the helpful offers to manage various aspects of my life, it had all been designed to establish a pattern that would later be used as evidence of my declining capacity. They'd even been documenting our conversations, recording phone calls where they would deliberately confuse me or ask leading questions designed to make me sound uncertain or forgetful. They'd been building a case file that they planned to present to a judge as evidence that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. The violation of this discovery was almost unbearable. Every conversation with my daughter over the past year, every moment I'd felt grateful for her increased attention and care, had been a performance designed to facilitate the theft of everything Richard and I had worked for. But Thomas had also unknowingly given me the key to my revenge. Mrs. Mitchell, there's something else you should know. Your daughter asked me to put together a complete financial profile of your assets, including detailed information about your bank accounts, investment portfolios, and property holdings. She said she needed it to help you organize your affairs more effectively. And did you provide that information? Not yet. I was supposed to deliver it when they return from California. But Mrs. Mitchell, under the circumstances, I think that information might be more useful to you than to them. That evening, as I tucked Sophie into bed, my heart breaking for this innocent child caught in the middle of her parents' monstrous scheme, she looked up at me with those trusting blue eyes. Grandma Eleanor, are you okay? You seem sad. I smoothed her hair back, just as I had for her mother 30 years ago. I'm okay, sweetheart. Grandma is just thinking about some important decisions. Are you thinking about what I told you? She whispered. About Mommy and Daddy and the money. Yes, honey, I am. I'm sorry I told you. I didn't want to make you sad. My heart broke all over again. This beautiful child was apologizing for telling me the truth about her parents' betrayal. She was already learning to protect the feelings of adults at the expense of honesty, already being taught that keeping family secrets was more important than standing up for what was right. Sophie, listen to me very carefully, I said, taking her small hands in mine. You did exactly the right thing by telling me. You should never apologize for telling the truth, especially when someone you love needs to know it. Do you understand? She nodded solemnly. And Sophie, whatever happens when your parents come home, I want you to remember that Grandma Eleanor loves you more than anything in this world, and that will never, ever change. As I walked back down the hallway that night, past all the expensive gifts I'd lavished on this family, I felt the last traces of doubt leave my mind. Jessica and David had made their choice when they decided to betray the woman who had loved them unconditionally. They'd made their choice when they decided my trust was a weakness to be exploited rather than a gift to be treasured. Now it was time for me to make mine. The plan I'd been crafting for the past 2 days was about to enter its final phase. And when Jessica and David returned from their inheritance planning vacation, they were going to discover that their elderly, supposedly incompetent target had been several steps ahead of them the entire time. Thursday morning dawned grey and cold, matching my mood perfectly as I prepared for the most difficult phone call of my entire life. Jessica and David were scheduled to return the following evening, which meant I had less than 36 hours to execute the most important part of my plan. Sophie was at school, the house was quiet, and I had my phone, my laptop, and a list of numbers that would either save my future or destroy my family forever. There would be no going back from what I was about to do. I'd spent most of Wednesday night staring at the ceiling, weighing my options and trying to find a path that might preserve some semblance of the relationship I'd thought I had with my daughter. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard Sophie's innocent whisper, "They traveled to take all your inheritance." The betrayal was complete, systematic, and unforgivable. Jessica hadn't just decided to steal from me. She'd recruited professionals, built false narratives, and orchestrated an elaborate fraud that would have left me penniless and powerless in my own life. This wasn't a moment of weakness or desperation. This was calculated cruelty directed at the woman who had given her life. My first call was to William Harper, my attorney. "Eleanor, I've been expecting to hear from you. What did you decide?" "I've decided to protect myself, William. I want you to initiate immediate changes to all my estate planning documents. I want Jessica and David completely removed as beneficiaries, and I want new financial structures put in place that make it impossible for anyone to challenge my competency or gain control over my assets." "Eleanor, are you absolutely certain? Once we do this, there's no undoing it quietly. If Jessica and David are planning what we think they're planning, these changes will become apparent very quickly." I thought about Sophie, about the little girl who would grow up knowing that her parents had tried to destroy her grandmother for money. I thought about the example I wanted to set for her about standing up to bullies, even when those bullies were family members. "I'm certain, William. But I want to go further than that. I want to create a trust for Sophie's education and future needs that her parents can't touch. And I want to make sure my estate goes to causes that actually help people instead of funding the lifestyle of two people who think love is a business transaction." "What are you thinking?" "I want the majority of my estate to go to elder abuse prevention organizations, financial literacy programs for seniors, and legal aid societies that help older adults protect themselves from family fraud. And I want Jessica and David to know exactly why they've been disinherited." William was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor, I have to ask. Is this revenge, or is this justice?" "What's the difference, William? They tried to steal everything Richard and I worked for by painting me as an incompetent old woman. They hired professionals to build a false case against my mental capacity. They manipulated my love for my granddaughter and my desire to help my family. If that's not grounds for complete disinheritance, what is?" "You're right," he said quietly. "When do you want to do this?" "Today. I want everything filed and official before they return tomorrow evening." My second call was to Margaret, who had more intelligence about Jessica and David's California activities. "Eleanor, honey, I have news, but you're not going to like it." "Tell me." "They've retained an attorney in California who specializes in competency challenges. They're planning to file paperwork when they get back to Ohio to have you evaluated for mental capacity. They've apparently been gathering evidence for months." My blood ran cold. How much time do I have? Based on what my contacts are telling me, they're planning to move very quickly. They want to establish legal guardianship before you have time to make any changes to your financial arrangements. Then we move faster. That afternoon, William arrived at Jessica's house with a mobile notary and enough legal documents to completely restructure my entire estate. We spread everything across the dining room table, the same table where I'd shared countless family meals, where I'd helped Sophie with homework, where I'd made the decision to co-sign the mortgage on this house. As I signed document after document, officially removing Jessica and David from my will and establishing new structures that protected my assets from any future challenges, I felt something shift inside me. The grief was still there, sharp and constant. But alongside it was something stronger, the satisfaction of taking back control. The new will was simple and devastating. Sophie would inherit a substantial education trust when she turned 18, enough to pay for college, graduate school, and help her start her adult life without financial stress. Everything else, the house Richard and I had built together, the rental properties, the investment accounts, the life insurance payouts, would go to organizations that actually helped people instead of exploited them. But the real masterpiece was the letter I'd written to accompany the will. A detailed explanation of exactly why Jessica and David had been disinherited, including documentation of their fraud attempts, copies of their communications with California attorneys, and a complete timeline of their systematic manipulation and betrayal. Eleanor, William said as we finished the paperwork, this is thorough, it's legally bulletproof, and it's going to destroy them financially. Are you prepared for what comes next? What comes next, William, is that two people who thought they could manipulate and steal from me learn that actions have consequences. What comes next is that my granddaughter grows up seeing that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's hard. That evening, Thomas Chen called with the final piece of intelligence I needed. Mrs. Mitchell, Jessica, and David are flying back tomorrow afternoon. They've scheduled a meeting with a local attorney for Monday morning to begin competency proceedings against you. They're planning to move fast. How fast? They want to have you evaluated and potentially placed under guardianship within 2 weeks. They've been telling people you're a danger to yourself financially, that you're being taken advantage of by strangers, and that you need immediate protection. The irony was breathtaking. The two people trying to steal everything I owned were positioning themselves as my protectors from financial exploitation. Thomas, I want you to be at their house when they arrive tomorrow evening. I want you to document their reaction to what they're about to discover. What are they going to discover? They're going to discover that their supposedly incompetent target has been several steps ahead of them this entire time. That night, as I lay in their guest bedroom for the last time, I thought about the 20 years since Richard's death. 20 years of rebuilding my life, of learning to be alone, of discovering strength I didn't know I possessed. 20 years of loving my daughter and her family unconditionally, of putting their needs ahead of my own comfort, of believing that family meant forever. Jessica had taught me that family was conditional. That love could be weaponized. That trust was just another asset to be exploited when the stakes were high enough. But she'd also taught me something else, that I was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Tomorrow evening, when she walked through the door expecting to find a confused, manipulated old woman she could easily control, she was going to find someone very different. She was going to find a woman who had spent 4 days systematically dismantling every aspect of their plan while playing the perfect grandmother to the child they'd used as cover for their betrayal. She was going to find Eleanor Catherine Mitchell, and she was going to learn that 6 to 7 years old didn't mean defenseless. It meant experienced. It meant smart. It meant absolutely done with being underestimated. If you're watching this story unfold and you've ever been betrayed by family members who thought your love made you weak, make sure you hit that subscribe button and check out the description below for more stories about people who refuse to be victims. Because tomorrow, Jessica and David were about to learn what happens when you underestimate the wrong grandmother. Friday evening arrived with a cold rain that seemed to match the chill in my bones as I waited for Jessica and David to return from their inheritance-stealing expedition. I'd spent the day making final preparations, and now everything was in place for the confrontation that would either destroy our family completely or reveal what kind of family we'd actually been all along. Sophie was in the living room, sprawled on the carpet with her coloring books, blissfully unaware that her world was about to change forever. I'd made her favorite dinner, homemade mac and cheese with the expensive organic cheese I always bought her, because I wanted her last normal evening to be perfect. At 6:47 p.m., I heard their car in the driveway. My hands were steady as I opened the front door. Jessica looked tanned and relaxed, her blonde hair sun-streaked, her smile bright with what I now recognized as the satisfaction of a successful mission. David was pulling their luggage from the trunk, and when he looked up and saw me, his expression was carefully neutral. Practiced. Mom. Jessica rushed up the steps and wrapped me in a hug that made my skin crawl. How was everything? Was Sophie good for you? Sophie was perfect, I replied, stepping back from her embrace. She told me some very interesting things while you were gone. Jessica's smile flickered for just a moment. Oh? What kind of interesting things? The kind of things that made me realize I've been a fool for 20 years. David had reached the porch now, and I could see the alarm in his eyes as he processed my tone. These two people who thought they knew me so well had never heard this voice before, the voice of a woman with nothing left to lose. Mom, what are you talking about? Jessica's laugh was forced, nervous. You look upset. Are you feeling okay? And there it was. The opening gambit of their strategy. Plant the seed of doubt about my mental state, make everyone around us question whether I was thinking clearly, set the stage for their competency challenge. I'm feeling clearer than I've felt in years, Jessica. Crystal clear, actually. Why don't you both come inside? We need to have a conversation, and I think you're going to find it very enlightening. As we walked into the living room, I saw David and Jessica exchange a quick glance. They were trying to read the situation, trying to figure out how much I knew and how to handle whatever resistance I might offer to their plans. "Sophie, sweetheart," I called to my granddaughter, "why don't you go upstairs and get ready for your bath? I need to talk to Mommy and Daddy about grown-up things." "Okay, Grandma Eleanor." Sophie bounced up from the floor and paused to hug me. "I love you, Grandma." "I love you too, baby. More than you'll ever know." As soon as Sophie's footsteps faded up the stairs, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Jessica and David sat on the couch, the expensive leather couch I'd helped them buy, and waited for me to explain my strange mood. I remained standing, looking down at them from across the coffee table that had been another gift from their loving, generous mother-in-law. "How was California?" I asked conversationally. "It was wonderful," Jessica said, her voice carefully bright. "Very relaxing. We hadn't had time alone together in so long." "And what did you do with all that alone time? Besides meeting with estate planning attorneys and private investigators, I mean." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the blood drain from Jessica's face, watched David's carefully maintained composure crack like ice. "Mom, I don't know what you think you." "I think," I interrupted, my voice cutting through her stammered denial like a blade, "that you've been planning to steal my inheritance for months. I think you've been building a false case to have me declared incompetent so you could gain control of everything Richard and I worked for. I think you've been manipulating my love for this family to position yourselves to commit financial fraud against me." Jessica's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. David's face had gone completely white. "I think," I continued, pulling out a folder from the side table, "that you hired Thomas Chen to investigate my mental capacity and document evidence of my supposed financial incompetence. I think you've been recording our phone conversations and deliberately trying to confuse me to create evidence of cognitive decline. I think you've spent the last 4 days in California consulting with attorneys about the fastest way to take legal control of my assets." I dropped the folder on the coffee table between us. It landed with a satisfying thud. "The good news is that Thomas Chen is very good at his job. The bad news for you is that I hired him away from you on Tuesday, and everything he documented about your fraud attempts is in that folder." David found his voice first. "Eleanor, this is a misunderstanding. We would never." "You would never what, David? You would never lie to me? You would never manipulate me? You would never hire professionals to help you steal from me?" My voice was rising now, 20 years of suppressed anger finally finding its voice. "Which part exactly would you never do? Because according to the evidence in that folder, you've done all of it." Jessica began to cry, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of panic, the tears of someone watching a carefully constructed plan collapse in real time. "Mom, please, you have to understand. We're worried about you. You're getting older, and we just want to make sure you're protected." "Protected?" I laughed, and it was a harsh, bitter sound. "Jessica, you want to know what I need protection from? I need protection from my own daughter, who's been systematically manipulating me for months to justify stealing everything I own." I picked up another folder from the side table, this one thicker than the first. "This folder contains copies of all your communications with California attorneys, documentation of your fraud attempts, records of every manipulative conversation we've had over the past year, and a complete timeline of your systematic financial abuse." Jessica's crying intensified, but I was far beyond being moved by her tears. "This folder also contains copies of my new will, which I had legally executed yesterday afternoon. Would you like to know what's in it?" The look of terror on their faces told me they already suspected. Sophie inherits a substantial education trust when she turns 18. Everything else, the house, the rental properties, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies, every single dollar Richard and I saved over 45 years of marriage, goes to elder abuse prevention organizations and legal aid societies. "Mom, no," Jessica whispered. "You can't do this. You can't leave us with nothing." "I can't leave you with nothing." My voice was incredulous. "Jessica, you were planning to take everything from me and have me declared incompetent. You were going to steal my home, my security, my independence, my dignity. But I can't leave you with nothing." David stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "This is insane, Eleanor. You're making a huge mistake. We're your family. We love you. If this is what your love looks like, David, I'd rather be alone." "You will be alone," he shouted, dropping all pretense of concern or affection. You'll die alone in some nursing home with no family, no visitors, nothing. Is that what you want? And there it was. The real David, the one who'd been hiding behind fake concern and manufactured worry. The one who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle between him and my money. You know what, David? Being alone with my dignity intact sounds infinitely better than being surrounded by family members who see me as an ATM with a pulse. Jessica was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that might have moved me a week ago. But that was before I knew that every tear she'd shed over the past year had been calculated, every expression of concern had been performance, every moment of increased attention had been research for their theft. There's one more thing, I said, reaching for the third and final folder. This contains the paperwork I filed yesterday to remove both of you from any access to Sophie's trust fund. She'll receive everything when she turns 18, but until then, it will be managed by an independent trustee who actually has her best interests at heart. You can't do that, David snarled. She's our daughter. Yes, she is. And someday she's going to ask why her parents tried to steal her grandmother's inheritance instead of building their own financial security through honest work. What are you going to tell her, David? That Grandma Eleanor was just too selfish to let you take everything she owned. The front door opened, and Thomas Chen walked in with a briefcase and a very professional expression. Jessica and David spun around, confusion replacing anger on their faces. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, Thomas said formally, I'm here to return the materials you provided for your investigation into Mrs. Mitchell's mental capacity, along with documentation of your fraud attempts that I'll be submitting to the authorities. Thomas, I said calmly, did you get everything documented? Every word, Mrs. Mitchell. The recording equipment you requested has captured this entire conversation, including Mr. Henderson's threats and both of their admissions of fraudulent intent. Jessica's sobs stopped abruptly as the full scope of what had just happened sank in. They hadn't just been caught, they'd been systematically outmaneuvered by the woman they'd dismissed as a confused, lonely old lady. You set us up, David whispered. No, David. You set yourselves up. I just made sure there was evidence when you did it. That night, after Jessica and David had left in stunned silence, after the police had taken their statements about the attempted financial fraud, after the house had finally fallen quiet, I sat in Sophie's room watching her sleep. She was staying with me for the next few days while Jessica and David figured out how to explain to an 8-year-old that their plan to steal from her grandmother had backfired spectacularly. As I smoothed her golden hair back from her forehead, I thought about the conversation we would eventually need to have. The conversation about why her parents weren't speaking to me, why there would be no more family dinners, why Grandma Eleanor's house would become her primary refuge from the chaos her parents' greed had created. It would be a hard conversation. But it would be an honest one. Because if I'd learned anything from this devastating betrayal, it was that honesty, even painful honesty, was always better than beautiful lies. Sophie stirred in her sleep and smiled, and I knew that whatever else happened, I had protected this innocent child from growing up thinking that love was conditional, that family meant exploitation, that trust was a weakness to be taken advantage of. I had shown her that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who refuse to let you get away with hurting others. Even when those others happen to be your own grandmother. The next morning brought a silence unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the peaceful quiet of a house at rest, but the hollow, echoing emptiness of relationships that had been shattered beyond repair. Sophie was still asleep in her bed, her face peaceful and innocent in the grey morning light filtering through her princess curtains. In a few hours, I would have to explain to this beautiful child why her world had changed overnight, why the family dinner table would never look the same again, why the adults she trusted most had chosen money over love. I made coffee in Jessica's kitchen, though I supposed it would soon be former Jessica's kitchen, given that I'd been co-signer on the mortgage and the new will would make continuing those payments impossible for them, and tried to process the magnitude of what had happened. My phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. William Harper had called 3 times. Margaret had called twice. My brother Robert had left 4 voicemails. But the calls I was dreading were the ones that would inevitably come from Jessica and David once they'd had time to consult with attorneys and figure out their legal options. If you're watching this unfold from wherever you are in the world, and you've ever had to make the choice between protecting yourself and preserving family peace, then you understand the weight settling on my chest. Comment below if you've been in a situation where doing the right thing meant losing people you loved, because I need to know I'm not alone in understanding how victory can taste so much like loss. The first call I returned was to William. Eleanor, I've been worried about you all night. How did the confrontation go? About as well as you'd expect when you catch family members red-handed planning to steal everything you own. Did they admit to it? David admitted to it when he lost his temper and started shouting about how I'd die alone in a nursing home. Thomas Chen got everything on recording, just as we planned. William was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you have any regrets about how you handled this? I thought about Jessica's face when she realized she'd been outmaneuvered. I thought about the tears that had seemed real until I remembered they were coming from someone who'd been systematically lying to me for months. I thought about David's rage when he realized their inheritance theft had become a criminal matter. My only regret, William, is that it took me so long to see what they really were. And Sophie? How are you going to handle the situation with Sophie? That question hit me like a physical blow. In all my planning and maneuvering and strategic thinking, I'd been focused on protecting Sophie's financial future. But I hadn't fully considered the emotional trauma of being caught in the middle of her parents' spectacular moral failure. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know how to explain to an 8-year-old that her parents tried to steal from me, or that they've been lying and manipulating and planning to have me declared incompetent. I don't know how to help her understand that sometimes people you love do things that are unforgivable. Eleanor, have you considered the possibility that this situation might be traumatic enough to affect custody arrangements? I hadn't considered it, but as soon as William said it, I realized he was right. Jessica and David had just been caught attempting financial fraud against a family member. They'd hired professionals to build false cases against my mental capacity. They'd been systematically lying and manipulating for months. Were these the kind of people who should have sole custody of a child? William, I want you to research my options regarding Sophie. If Jessica and David are capable of this level of deception and manipulation with me, what does that say about their parenting? What kind of values are they teaching her? I'll make some calls. Eleanor, custody battles are ugly, especially when they involve family members. Are you prepared for that level of conflict? I thought about Sophie's innocent whisper that had started this whole revelation. I thought about how she'd been used as cover for her parents' criminal planning, how she'd been positioned as a shield to keep me from suspecting their true motives. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to protect that child from growing up thinking that lying and stealing and manipulating people who love you is normal family behavior. My second call was to Margaret, who had news that made my stomach clench with dread. Eleanor, honey, I think you need to know. Jessica has been calling everyone in your social circle since last night. She's telling people that you've had some kind of mental breakdown, that you've been acting erratically, that she's concerned about your judgment and decision-making abilities. The audacity was breathtaking. Even caught red-handed, Jessica was still trying to execute her original plan of painting me as mentally incompetent. What exactly is she telling people? She's saying that you've become paranoid and suspicious, that you're imagining conspiracies that don't exist, that you've made drastic changes to your will based on delusions about your own family trying to hurt you. I laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. So even after being caught attempting financial fraud, she's still trying to gaslight me and everyone who knows me. Eleanor, I hate to say this, but she's being very convincing. She sounds genuinely concerned and heartbroken. If I didn't know the truth about what she'd been planning, I might believe her myself. That was the moment I realized that Jessica's betrayal went even deeper than financial theft. She was now trying to destroy my reputation, my relationships, my standing in the community that had been my support system for 20 years. She was weaponizing my own social connections against me, turning my friends into allies in her campaign to paint me as mentally unstable. Margaret, I need you to do something for me. I need you to set up a meeting with our core group, you, Patricia, Helen, and Betty. I need to tell them exactly what happened before Jessica's version of events becomes the accepted truth. Of course, dear. Eleanor, I'm so sorry this is happening to you. Don't be sorry for me, Margaret. Be sorry for Jessica, because she's about to learn that destroying someone's reputation works both ways. That afternoon, I had what was simultaneously the hardest and most important conversation of my life. Sophie and I sat in her bedroom, surrounded by all the toys and books and beautiful things I'd bought her over the years, and I tried to explain why her world was falling apart. Sophie, sweetheart, do you remember what you told me the other night about Mommy and Daddy's vacation? She nodded solemnly. Well, what you overheard was true. Your parents were planning to take Grandma's money without asking, which is something that's against the law. Are Mommy and Daddy in trouble? Yes, honey, they are. But more than that, they hurt Grandma's feelings very badly by lying and trying to take things that didn't belong to them. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing information that no child should ever have to understand. Grandma Eleanor, are you going to stop loving Mommy because she was bad? The question nearly broke my heart. How do you explain to a child that love and trust are different things, that you can love someone while still protecting yourself from their harmful choices? Sophie, I will always love your Mommy because she's my daughter and she gave me the most wonderful granddaughter in the world. But sometimes when people we love make very bad choices, we have to protect ourselves from being hurt again, even if that means we can't spend time with them anymore. Will I still get to see you? Baby girl, as long as you want to see me, I will move heaven and earth to make sure that happens. You did nothing wrong, and you should never have to pay the price for your parents' bad choices. That evening, as Sophie played quietly in the living room, my phone rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and after a moment's hesitation, I answered. Mom, we need to talk. Her voice was different now. Gone was the fake warmth, the manipulative concern, the carefully practiced tones of a loving daughter. This was the voice of someone who'd been backed into a corner and was ready to fight. I think we said everything that needed to be said last night, Jessica. No, we didn't. You've destroyed this family over a misunderstanding. You've filed false reports with the police, you've changed your will out of spite, and you've traumatized Sophie with adult problems she shouldn't have to deal with. The gaslighting was so blatant it was almost impressive. Jessica, let me ask you a simple question. Were you or were you not meeting with attorneys in California to discuss having me declared incompetent so you could take control of my finances? Silence. Were you or were you not planning to petition for guardianship based on false claims about my mental capacity? More silence. Were you or were you not building a case file of fabricated evidence about my supposed cognitive decline? Mom, you don't understand the pressure we're under. The mortgage, Sophie's school, David's business loans, we needed help, and we thought maybe if we had more control over your finances, we could. You could steal from me more efficiently. It's not stealing if it's family. And there it was. The fundamental belief system that had allowed Jessica to justify months of lies, manipulation, and fraud. She genuinely believed that being related to me gave her the right to take whatever she wanted from me, regardless of my consent or knowledge. Jessica, it's absolutely stealing if it's family. It's worse than stealing, because it's stealing wrapped in betrayal. Fine. You want to destroy your own family over money? You want to die alone and bitter? That's your choice. But don't you dare try to turn Sophie against us. She's our daughter, and we won't let you poison her mind with your paranoid delusions. Sophie will make her own decisions about who to trust based on who tells her the truth and who lies to her. Just like I did. I hung up the phone and immediately called William Harper. William, I want you to file for emergency custody of Sophie. Tonight. Eleanor, that's a big step. Are you sure? Jessica just threatened to prevent me from seeing Sophie unless I allow them to continue their fraud attempts. She's using that child as leverage to force me to accept financial abuse. Yes, I'm sure. That night, as I tucked Sophie into bed in what might be the last peaceful evening we'd share for a long time, I thought about the chain of events that had led us to this point. One innocent whisper from a child who'd overheard something she didn't fully understand. One moment of truth that had revealed months of elaborate deception. Tomorrow would bring custody hearings, legal battles, and the complete destruction of what I'd thought was a loving family relationship. Tomorrow would bring consequences that none of us could have imagined a week ago. But tonight, I held my granddaughter close and promised her that no matter what happened next, she would always have someone in her corner who valued truth over peace, honesty over comfort, and protection over pretense. Even if that someone was just one grandmother who'd finally learned the difference between being loved and being used. 3 weeks after the confrontation that shattered my family, I sat in a sterile conference room facing the people I'd raised and loved across a mahogany table that might as well have been a canyon. Jessica and David had their attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Linda Rodriguez who specialized in elder law and had probably seen cases like mine before. I had William Harper, 40 years of legal experience, and a folder full of evidence that made their fraud attempts look like amateur hour. Between us sat Sophie's court-appointed advocate, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Sarah Chen who'd spent the past 2 weeks interviewing everyone involved in what had become an official custody dispute. Sophie herself was in school, blissfully unaware that her future was being decided by adults who'd forgotten how to trust each other. The mediator, Judge Patricia Hawkins, looked tired before we'd even begun. I wondered how many families she'd watched tear themselves apart over money, how many grandparents and parents had sat in this same room choosing legal victory over love. Mrs. Mitchell, Judge Hawkins began, you filed for emergency custody of your granddaughter based on claims that her parents attempted to commit financial fraud against you. You've also alleged that this fraud attempt demonstrates unfitness for parenting. Can you summarize your position? I'd rehearsed this moment for weeks, but sitting there looking at Jessica, my daughter, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep and worried over and celebrated with for 35 years, the prepared words felt like ash in my mouth. Your Honor, this case isn't really about money. It's about the kind of people Jessica and David have revealed themselves to be, and whether those are the kind of people who should be raising a child. Linda Rodriguez leaned forward. Your Honor, Mrs. Mitchell is clearly still upset about a family disagreement that got out of hand. Her response has been disproportionate and vindictive. She's weaponizing the court system to punish her daughter for what amounts to a misunderstanding about financial planning. I felt my blood pressure spike. A misunderstanding. Mrs. Mitchell, Judge Hawkins said firmly, please address your comments to the court. Your Honor, there was no misunderstanding. Jessica and David spent months planning to have me declared incompetent so they could steal my entire estate. They hired private investigators, consulted with attorneys, and built elaborate fictional cases about my mental decline. They systematically manipulated my love for my family to position themselves for fraud. This isn't a family disagreement, it's attempted theft disguised as concern. Dr. Chen consulted her notes. Mrs. Mitchell, in my interviews with Sophie, she's expressed confusion about why the adults in her life are suddenly fighting. She's mentioned that you've told her that her parents tried to take Grandma's money, and she's asked whether that makes them bad people. How do you respond to concerns that you're involving a child in adult conflicts? The question hit me like a physical blow, but I'd expected it. Jessica had been building a case that I was emotionally damaging Sophie by telling her the truth about her parents' behavior. Dr. Chen, Sophie was the one who first told me about her parents' plan. She overheard them discussing their trip to California to meet with lawyers about taking my inheritance. I didn't involve her in this conflict. She was already involved because her parents used her as cover for their criminal planning. Jessica spoke for the first time. Mom, Sophie is 8 years old. She doesn't understand what she heard. You've taken an innocent comment and turned it into this elaborate conspiracy theory. Jessica, I have recordings of you and David admitting to fraud attempts. I have documentation from the private investigator you hired. I have copies of your communications with California attorneys about competency challenges. Which part of that is a conspiracy theory? Linda Rodriguez interrupted. Your Honor, Mrs. Mitchell has admitted to recording private conversations without consent and hiring away a private investigator to spy on her own family members. Her behavior has been erratic and paranoid. William Harper finally spoke. Your Honor, Mrs. Mitchell's behavior has been protective, not paranoid. When someone discovers that family members are planning to steal their life savings, documentation and evidence gathering are reasonable responses. Judge Hawkins looked at the stack of evidence William had submitted. Mrs. Rodriguez, I've reviewed the documentation Mrs. Mitchell provided. The communications between your clients and California attorneys are quite explicit about their intentions to challenge Mrs. Mitchell's competency and gain control of her finances. How do you explain these documents? Your Honor, my clients were genuinely concerned about Mrs. Mitchell's ability to manage her own affairs. They sought legal advice about how to help protect her from financial exploitation. By exploiting her financially themselves. Linda Rodriguez's composure cracked slightly. They were trying to ensure family assets remained within the family, Your Honor. Family assets. I couldn't contain myself any longer. Those aren't family assets. Those are my assets. Assets I earned with my husband over 45 years of marriage. Assets I have every legal right to dispose of however I choose. Mrs. Mitchell, Dr. Chen said gently, can you help me understand how this financial conflict affects Sophie's daily well-being and safety? It was the right question, the crucial question that would determine whether my granddaughter continued living with parents who demonstrated they were willing to lie, manipulate, and commit fraud to get what they wanted. Dr. Chen, Sophie is being raised by people who spent months planning to steal from her grandmother. They hired professionals to build false cases against my mental capacity. They've been teaching her, through their actions, that lying and manipulation are acceptable tools for getting what you want from people who love you. I paused, thinking about all the conversations I'd had with Sophie over the years about honesty, kindness, and treating others with respect. More than that, they used Sophie herself as cover for their fraud attempts. They brought her to my house for visits specifically so I wouldn't suspect they were plotting against me. They turned my love for my granddaughter into a weapon against me. What kind of parents use their own child as a shield for criminal activity? Jessica began crying, and for a moment I felt a flicker of the old sympathy. Then I remembered that these were the same tears she'd used to manipulate me for months while planning to steal everything I owned. Your Honor, Jessica said through her sobs, my mother is determined to destroy our family over money. She's chosen her finances over her relationships. She's turned Sophie against us by telling her that her parents are bad people. She's traumatizing a child to get revenge. I've chosen honesty over comfortable lies, I replied. I've chosen to protect Sophie from learning that fraud and manipulation are normal family behaviors. And I've chosen to demonstrate that people who try to steal from you don't get to keep access to your love and trust. David, who'd been silent through most of the hearing, finally spoke up. Eleanor, you're destroying Sophie's sense of security. She needs stability, not this constant conflict. David, you destroyed Sophie's sense of security when you decided to use her as cover for planning to steal her grandmother's inheritance. You created this conflict when you chose to see me as a mark rather than as family. Judge Hawkins consulted her notes for several minutes while the rest of us sat in tense silence. Finally, she looked up. This is one of the most disturbing cases I've encountered in 20 years on the bench. Not because of the financial dispute, but because of the systematic nature of the deception involved and the impact on a minor child. My heart began to race. Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Henderson, the evidence clearly demonstrates that you engaged in elaborate planning to defraud Mrs. Mitchell. You hired professionals, consulted with attorneys, and built fictional cases about her mental capacity for the explicit purpose of gaining illegal control of her finances. Jessica gripped David's hand, both of them pale as sheets. Dr. Chen, in your professional opinion, what are the implications for Sophie's emotional and psychological development if she continues to live with parents who've demonstrated this level of deception and manipulation? Dr. Chen looked uncomfortable, but her answer was clear. Your Honor, children who witness systematic lying and manipulation by parental figures often struggle with trust issues, moral development, and their own sense of security. The fact that Sophie was used as unknowing cover for fraudulent activity is particularly concerning from a child development perspective. Furthermore, Dr. Chen continued, Sophie has expressed confusion about whether her parents are bad people because they tried to take Grandma's money. She's struggling to reconcile her love for her parents with her understanding that stealing is wrong. This kind of moral confusion can have long-lasting psychological effects. Judge Hawkins nodded slowly. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm prepared to grant you temporary custody of Sophie pending a full psychological evaluation of all parties and a comprehensive review of the living situations involved. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica's sobs became louder, more desperate. David looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Linda Rodriguez began shuffling through papers, probably already planning their appeal. Your Honor, Linda Rodriguez said desperately, this decision will traumatize Sophie far more than allowing her to remain in her familiar environment with her parents. Ms. Rodriguez, Sophie's parents have demonstrated that they're willing to engage in systematic fraud and use their own daughter as cover for criminal activity. I'm more concerned about the trauma of allowing her to continue living with people who've shown such profound disregard for honesty and basic moral behavior. As we filed out of the courthouse an hour later, Jessica caught up with me in the parking lot. Her face was streaked with tears, but underneath the grief I could see something harder. Something that looked disturbingly like hatred. Are you happy now, Mom? You've gotten your revenge. You've taken our daughter away from us over money. Jessica, I didn't take Sophie away from you. You lost her when you decided that lying and stealing were acceptable parenting strategies. You lost her when you used her as cover for fraud attempts. You lost her when you chose to see your own mother as a mark rather than as family. This isn't over, David said, his voice tight with controlled rage. We'll appeal. We'll fight this. You might have won today, but you haven't won permanently. I looked at these two people I'd loved, these two people I'd helped and supported and trusted for so many years, and I felt nothing but exhaustion. David, I never wanted to win anything. I wanted to be loved honestly by my family. I wanted to trust the people I'd given everything to. I wanted to grow old knowing that my sacrifice and generosity meant something more than being seen as an easy target. You wanted to control us, Jessica spat. You wanted to keep us dependent on your money so you could feel important and needed. And there it was. The final revelation of how differently we'd viewed our relationship all along. In Jessica's mind, my generosity had been manipulation. My love had been control. My desire to help had been a power play. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had enjoyed being needed, being the solution to their problems, being the grandmother who could make everything better with a check and a hug. But the difference was that I'd never used my love as a weapon. I'd never pretended to care while plotting to destroy them. I'd never looked at my family members and seen dollar signs instead of people. That night, as I helped Sophie unpack her belongings in what would now be her bedroom in my house, I thought about the cost of learning the truth about the people you love most. The knowledge was devastating, but it was also liberating. I finally knew exactly where I stood with Jessica and David. I finally understood what my 20 years of generosity had meant to them. I finally recognized the difference between being loved and being useful. And for the first time since Richard's death, I felt like I knew who I really was when I wasn't trying to buy love from people who saw my affection as a business opportunity. It was a painful lesson, but it was also the beginning of the most honest relationship I'd had with myself in 20 years. 6 months after the custody hearing that changed everything, I stood in my kitchen making pancakes for Sophie and marveling at how quiet resilience could bloom in the most broken soil. The house felt different now, not like the hollow shell it had become after Richard's death, but like a home that had rediscovered its purpose. Sophie sat at the breakfast table, her blonde hair pulled back in the braids I was still learning to master, working on her homework with the kind of focused concentration that reminded me so much of Jessica at that age. The irony wasn't lost on me that in gaining custody of my granddaughter, I'd also gained a window into who my daughter had been before greed and desperation had twisted her into someone I no longer recognized. "Grandma Eleanor," Sophie said without looking up from her math worksheet, "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you can come to the parent-teacher conference next Tuesday." "Of course I can, sweetheart. Is there anything specific she wants to discuss?" Sophie shrugged in the way 8-year-olds do when they're not sure how much adult information they should share. "She said I've been doing better in school since I moved in with you. My concentration is better or something." I flipped the pancakes and tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside, my heart was breaking and healing simultaneously. Sophie's improvement wasn't just about living in a more stable environment. It was about living with someone who told her the truth, even when that truth was painful. The past 6 months had been the hardest of my life, but they'd also been the most clarifying. Taking custody of Sophie had meant learning to be a parent again at 6 to 7, which was exhausting in ways I'd forgotten possible. But it had also meant watching a confused, anxious child gradually transform into someone more confident, more secure, more honest about her own feelings and needs. If you're watching this unfold and you've ever had to choose between family peace and protecting someone vulnerable, you know how complicated these victories can feel. Hit that subscribe button and check the description below for more stories about people who chose courage over comfort, because sometimes the hardest decisions turn out to be the most important ones you'll ever make. Jessica and David had indeed appealed the custody decision, just as they'd threatened. Their appeal had been based on claims that I was too old to properly care for a child, that my vindictive actions proved I was unstable, and that Sophie was being brainwashed against her parents through my influence. The appeal process had been even more brutal than the original hearing. Linda Rodriguez had brought in expert witnesses to testify about the challenges of elderly caregiving, the psychological damage of parental alienation, and the importance of maintaining biological family bonds. They'd painted me as a bitter, controlling woman using my granddaughter as a weapon in a family financial dispute. But William Harper had been ready for them. He'd brought in Sophie's new therapist, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who testified about the remarkable improvement in Sophie's anxiety levels and behavioral issues since moving in with me. He'd presented evidence of Sophie's improved academic performance, her increased social confidence, and most importantly, her own clearly expressed preferences about where she wanted to live. The appeal had been denied 3 weeks ago, with Judge Hawkins noting in her written decision that the child's well-being and expressed preferences must take precedence over parental rights when those parents have demonstrated a pattern of deception and manipulation that directly impacts the child's moral and emotional development. Sophie had been in therapy since the custody hearing, working through her complicated feelings about her parents' actions and her new living situation. Dr. Martinez had explained to me that children Sophie's age were remarkably adaptable, but they also needed absolute honesty about their circumstances to process their emotions healthily. Sophie understands that her parents made some very bad choices, Dr. Martinez had told me during one of our sessions. She's not angry with them, but she's not confused about what happened either. She knows they tried to take something that didn't belong to them, and she knows that behavior has consequences. That moral clarity is actually very healthy for her development. The hardest part hadn't been the legal battles or the community gossip or even the financial costs of suddenly becoming a full-time parent again. The hardest part had been watching Sophie navigate her complicated feelings about her parents while trying to build a new sense of security with me. Jessica and David had been granted supervised visitation rights once per month, visits that took place at a family services center with a social worker present. Sophie had been conflicted about these visits at first, torn between her love for her parents and her confusion about their actions. They keep telling me that Grandma Eleanor is keeping us apart because she's angry about money, Sophie had told me after her third supervised visit. But that's not true, is it? What do you think, sweetheart? I think they're still not telling the truth. Because if they hadn't tried to take your money, we'd still all be together, right? The wisdom of children could be devastating in its simplicity. Margaret had been my lifeline through the transition, helping with carpools and grocery shopping and all the logistics of suddenly having a child in the house again. My brother Robert had flown in from Phoenix twice to offer moral support and to spend time with Sophie, who charmed him completely with her curiosity about his stories of our childhood. But perhaps most surprisingly, my social circle had rallied around me in ways I hadn't expected. Jessica's attempts to paint me as mentally unstable and vindictive had backfired when people who'd known me for decades were presented with actual evidence of her fraud attempts. Eleanor, I have to tell you, my friend Patricia had said over coffee last month, I was shocked when Jessica first called me crying about your breakdown. But when you showed us those documents, when we saw what they'd actually been planning, I've never seen anything so cold-blooded in my life. The community support had been gratifying, but it had also been educational. I'd learned who my real friends were, the ones who'd asked questions and demanded evidence rather than simply accepting Jessica's version of events. I'd learned who could be trusted with complicated truths and who preferred comfortable lies. Most importantly, I'd learned that protecting myself and Sophie from financial and emotional manipulation wasn't selfish or vindictive, it was necessary. The inheritance situation had been resolved according to my new will, with one significant addition. I'd established a fund to help other elderly adults who found themselves victims of family financial fraud. The Eleanor and Richard Mitchell Foundation for Elder Protection would launch next year, providing legal assistance and advocacy for seniors facing the same systematic manipulation I'd experienced. Grandma Eleanor, Sophie said, interrupting my thoughts as she looked up from her homework, can I ask you something? Always, sweetheart. Do you think Mommy and Daddy will ever say they're sorry for what they did? It was a question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Sophie asked the hard questions with the fearless curiosity of childhood, questions that cut straight to the heart of adult complexities. I don't know, Sophie. Sometimes when people make bad choices, they spend more energy trying to justify those choices than they do trying to make amends for them. But they could say sorry if they wanted to. Yes, they could. And if they did, would you forgive them? I set down the spatula and really looked at my granddaughter, this wise, resilient child who'd been forced to grow up too quickly because of her parents' greed and deception. Sophie, forgiveness is complicated when someone hurts you as badly as your parents hurt me. I might eventually forgive them for my own peace of mind, but that doesn't mean I would ever trust them again. And it doesn't mean they would get to come back into our lives as if nothing had happened. Because some things can't be fixed, even with sorry. That's right, baby girl. Some things can't be fixed with sorry. She nodded solemnly and returned to her homework, apparently satisfied with my answer. But I sat there thinking about the question she hadn't asked. Whether I missed Jessica and David, whether I regretted the choices that had led to our family's destruction, whether I wished things could have been different. The truth was complicated. I missed the people I'd thought they were. I grieved the relationships I'd believed we'd had. I mourned the family gatherings that would never happen again, the shared memories that had been tainted by the revelation of their true motives. But I didn't regret protecting myself and Sophie from their manipulation. I didn't regret choosing truth over peace. I didn't regret demonstrating that actions have consequences, even when those actions are taken by people you love. That evening, as I tucked Sophie into bed in her new bedroom, the room that had been Richard's home office, now transformed with princess bedding and bookshelves full of stories about brave girls who saved themselves, I thought about the unexpected gift that had emerged from this devastating betrayal. I'd learned that love didn't require sacrificing your dignity or your security. I discovered that family relationships built on honesty and respect were infinitely more valuable than those built on obligation and guilt. I'd found out that protecting someone vulnerable was worth the cost of losing people who'd never truly valued you anyway. "Grandma Eleanor," Sophie whispered as I turned out her light, "I'm glad I get to live with you." "I'm glad too, sweetheart. I'm sorry it had to happen this way, but I'm glad we found each other. We were always going to find each other. We just had to get through the scary part first." From the mouths of babes. As I settled into my own bedroom that night, I realized that Sophie was right. We'd gotten through the scary part, the betrayal, the legal battles, the complete reconstruction of our family structure. What remained was the daily work of building something better from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. It wasn't the family I'd planned for or hoped for, but it was honest, and it was built on truth rather than manipulation. It was small but strong, simple but genuine. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything I'd never known I wanted until I'd been forced to fight for it. 2 years after the night that changed everything, I received a phone call that proved the ripple effects of standing up for yourself can spread in directions you never anticipated. It was a Tuesday morning in November, crisp and bright, and Sophie was at school learning about fractions and the Revolutionary War while I was settling into the rhythm of a life I'd never planned but had grown to love. The caller was Linda Rodriguez, Jessica and David's former attorney, and her voice carried a weight I hadn't heard since the custody hearings. "Mrs. Mitchell, I hope you don't mind me calling. I have some information I thought you should know about, regarding Jessica and David." My first instinct was to hang up. Whatever crisis my daughter and son-in-law had landed themselves in wasn't my problem anymore. But something in Linda's tone made me pause. "What kind of information?" "They've been arrested, Mrs. Mitchell. Financial fraud charges. It appears that what they attempted with you wasn't an isolated incident." The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to process what I was hearing. Jessica and David hadn't just targeted me. I'd been part of a pattern. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you there?" "I'm here. Tell me what happened." What Linda told me over the next 30 minutes painted a picture that was both shocking and, in hindsight, completely predictable. After losing the custody battle and the inheritance they'd been counting on, Jessica and David had apparently decided that elderly financial fraud was a viable business model. They'd targeted 3 other seniors in the Columbus area, using variations of the same strategy they'd attempted with me. Concerned adult children, worried about aging parents, offering to help organize financial affairs while actually positioning themselves to steal everything. The first victim was David's elderly aunt in Westerville, Linda explained. They convinced her that her memory was failing, that she was making poor financial decisions, and that they needed to help manage her affairs to protect her from scammers. The irony was so bitter it made my stomach turn. How much did they steal? From the aunt, about $40,000 before her neighbor became suspicious and contacted Adult Protective Services. The second victim was a widower from Jessica's church. They got about $75,000 from him by convincing him that his adult children in California were trying to manipulate him financially and that he needed local family support. I felt sick. These weren't random victims, they were people Jessica and David had specifically targeted because they were lonely, vulnerable, and trustful of younger family members or community connections. The third victim was what brought them down, Linda continued. Margaret Thompson, 83 years old, a widow whose husband had been a retired police detective. They tried the same strategy with her, but she was suspicious from the beginning and had her nephew, who's a forensic accountant, investigate their claims about her finances. Margaret Thompson. Even the name made me smile grimly. They'd finally targeted someone who was too smart and too well-connected to fall for their manipulation. Mrs. Thompson documented everything and turned it over to the police. When they investigated Jessica and David's other activities, they found the pattern. 3 elderly victims, all targeted using similar methods of psychological manipulation and financial control. What are they charged with? Elder abuse, financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Mrs. Mitchell, they're looking at serious prison time. The prosecutor wants to make an example of them because financial elder abuse has become such a significant problem in Ohio. I sat in my kitchen, staring out at the backyard where Sophie's swing set stood covered with November frost, trying to process this information. The people I'd raised and loved and trusted had been revealed as systematic predators, targeting the most vulnerable members of society for financial exploitation. Linda, why are you telling me this? Because the prosecutor wants to include your case in their evidence. They want to show the pattern of behavior, the sophistication of the scheme, the systematic nature of their approach to elder fraud. They'd like you to testify. The thought of seeing Jessica and David again, of facing them across a courtroom while testifying about their attempts to steal from me, made my hands shake. But underneath the dread was something else, a fierce satisfaction that their pattern of victimizing elderly people was finally being stopped. When would the trial be? Probably early next year. Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to know that I feel terrible about representing them in the custody case. If I'd known they were part of a larger pattern of elder abuse, I never would have taken their case. Linda, you were doing your job. They lied to you just like they lied to everyone else. That afternoon, I called William Harper to discuss the implications of testifying in Jessica and David's criminal trial. Eleanor, this could be very difficult emotionally, but it's also an opportunity to ensure they face real consequences for their actions. What they did to you was just the beginning of what appears to be a systematic campaign of elder abuse. William, what kind of prison time are they looking at? For what they're charged with? Jessica could get 5 to 7 years. David, with his business background and the sophistication of the schemes, could get 8 to 10. Ohio takes financial elder abuse very seriously, especially when it involves multiple victims. That evening, when Sophie came home from school full of stories about her day and excitement about an upcoming field trip, I struggled with whether to tell her about her parents' arrests. At 10 years old now, she was old enough to understand the implications, but she was also finally settled and secure in her new life. Sophie, sweetheart, I need to tell you something about your parents. She looked up from her homework with those wise blue eyes that had seen too much adult complexity for someone her age. Are they in trouble again? Yes, honey, they are. They've been arrested for trying to take money from other elderly people, the same way they tried to take money from me. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the resilience that had developed over the past 2 years of therapy and honest conversations. So it wasn't just about you. They were doing this to other grandmas and grandpas too. Yes, sweetheart. 3 other people that we know of. That's really bad, isn't it? Yes, Sophie. It's really bad. She returned to her homework, apparently satisfied with my answer, but I could see her processing the implications. Her parents weren't just people who'd made one bad decision about family money, they were people who'd made a pattern of targeting vulnerable elderly people for exploitation. 3 weeks later, I sat in another courthouse, but this time the atmosphere was different. This wasn't a family dispute being mediated by a judge, this was a criminal proceeding where Jessica and David faced the full weight of the legal system for preying on elderly victims. Jessica looked pale and thin in her orange jumpsuit, her blonde hair pulled back severely. David sat beside her, his once confident demeanor replaced by the hollow look of someone facing the complete destruction of his life. They both looked older, defeated, nothing like the successful young couple who'd once seemed to have everything figured out. When I took the witness stand to testify about their systematic manipulation and fraud attempts against me, I looked directly at Jessica. I wanted her to see that the confused, lonely old woman she'd tried to victimize had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who refused to be anyone's easy target. Mrs. Mitchell, the prosecutor asked, can you describe the systematic nature of the defendant's approach to gaining access to your financial information? I told the court about the months of increased attention, the careful questions about my assets, the false expressions of concern about my mental capacity. I described how they'd used Sophie as cover for their research, how they turned my love for my family into a weapon against me. Mrs. Mitchell, in your opinion, were the defendant's actions planned and deliberate, or were they responding to a financial emergency? These were planned, systematic, and sophisticated. They researched my financial situation for months before taking action. They hired professionals to help them build false cases against my competency. They consulted with multiple attorneys about the fastest way to gain control of my assets. This wasn't desperation, this was calculated predation. When Jessica's attorney cross-examined me, she tried to paint the same picture Linda Rodriguez had attempted 2 years earlier, a vindictive old woman exaggerating a family financial dispute for revenge. But this time, the context was different. The courtroom had already heard testimony about 3 other elderly victims, about systematic targeting and sophisticated fraud schemes. My case wasn't an isolated family tragedy, it was part of a pattern of elder abuse that had been stopped only because I'd fought back and documented everything. The trial lasted 8 days. The other victims testified about their experiences, painting a picture of Jessica and David as skilled manipulators who targeted lonely, trusting elderly people with surgical precision. The forensic accountant explained how sophisticated their schemes had been, how they'd used professional services and legal consultations to make their fraud attempts more effective. When the verdicts were read, guilty on all counts for both defendants, I felt no satisfaction. Only sadness for the people they could have been if they'd chosen differently, and relief that their pattern of victimizing vulnerable people had finally been stopped. Jessica received 6 years in prison. David received 9 years. Both were ordered to pay restitution to their victims and were banned from working in any capacity that involved financial services or elder care. As I left the courthouse that final day, I thought about the unexpected journey that had led from Sophie's innocent whisper to this moment of legal resolution. None of it had been planned or anticipated, but all of it had been necessary. Jessica and David's attempts to steal from me had revealed their true character not just to me, but to the legal system that would now protect other elderly people from their predation. Their betrayal had cost them their freedom, their reputations, and their relationship with their daughter. Most importantly, their actions had taught Sophie, and hopefully other children who might hear this story, that honesty and courage matter more than family loyalty when that loyalty requires ignoring harmful behavior. Sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't just protect you. Sometimes it protects everyone who might become a victim after you. Sometimes the most personal battles have the most universal consequences. 5 years have passed since that Tuesday night when Sophie whispered the words that changed everything. I'm 72 now, and Sophie is 13, a bright, confident teenager who's grown into someone I couldn't have imagined when I first took custody of a confused and frightened 8-year-old. Today, as I write this final chapter of our story, Sophie is at the kitchen table working on an essay for her 8th grade English class about someone who influenced your life. She asked if she could write about me, about what she learned from watching me stand up to her parents, about how sometimes doing the right thing requires difficult choices. Grandma Eleanor, she said this morning over breakfast, Mrs. Johnson says our essays should focus on the life lessons we learned from our chosen person. What do you think the most important lesson was? I thought about it while I poured her orange juice and packed her lunch. 5 years of perspective had given me clarity about the deeper meaning of everything we'd been through. I think the most important lesson, sweetheart, was learning the difference between being loved and being used. And learning that real love never asks you to accept being hurt or manipulated. She nodded seriously and wrote that down in her notebook. At 13, Sophie had a wisdom about relationships and human nature that most people don't develop until much later in life. Our experience had fast-tracked her understanding of how people can manipulate love for selfish purposes, but it had also shown her what authentic, protective love looked like. The Eleanor and Richard Mitchell Foundation for Elder Protection had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I first established it. What started as a way to channel my anger and pain into something constructive had become a nationally recognized organization that had helped over 3,000 elderly victims of family financial fraud. We'd provided legal assistance, advocacy services, counseling support, and most importantly, we'd helped change laws in 12 states to make financial elder abuse prosecutions more effective. The foundation had become my way of ensuring that other grandparents didn't have to navigate the nightmare I'd experienced without support and resources. Margaret still served on our board of directors, along with my brother Robert and Dr. Sarah Chen, Sophie's former advocate. We met quarterly to review cases and develop new programs, and every meeting reminded me of how many elderly people faced the same systematic betrayal I'd experienced from family members who saw them as assets rather than human beings. Eleanor, Margaret had said at our most recent board meeting, you realize we've probably prevented millions of dollars in elder fraud over the past 5 years? The legal precedents we've helped establish, the awareness we've created, the support systems we've built, it's had an enormous impact. The impact had been personal too. Working with other elder fraud victims had shown me that my experience, while devastating, wasn't unique. Family betrayal around money was far more common than I'd ever imagined, and the patterns were remarkably consistent. Increased attention masquerading as concern, systematic information gathering disguised as helpfulness, and eventual moves to gain legal or practical control over assets. But I'd also learned that recovery was possible. That trust could be rebuilt, albeit more carefully. That families could be reconstructed around honesty instead of obligation. That love could be deeper and more authentic when it was based on choice rather than genetics. Jessica was released from prison 18 months ago, after serving 4.5 years of her 6-year sentence. David was released 6 months ago, after serving 7 years of his 9-year sentence. Both were required to remain in Ohio as part of their parole conditions, and both were prohibited from having any contact with their elderly victims. They'd reached out through their parole officers to request visits with Sophie, but she declined each time. At 13, she was old enough to make her own decisions about those relationships, and she'd been clear about her boundaries. "I don't hate them," she told Dr. Martinez during one of her occasional therapy check-ins. "But I don't trust them, and I don't want to pretend that what they did was okay just because they're my parents. Grandma Eleanor taught me that love doesn't mean accepting bad behavior." The supervised visitation option remained open if Sophie ever changed her mind, but she showed no signs of wanting to rebuild relationships with parents who demonstrated such profound disregard for honesty and basic moral behavior. Instead, she'd built a rich, full life with me and the extended family we'd created together. My brother Robert visited from Phoenix twice a year, and Sophie had formed a special bond with him and his stories about our childhood. Margaret had become like a second grandmother, teaching Sophie to cook and sharing memories of her grandfather Richard. Dr. Chen had remained a mentor and friend, helping Sophie process the complicated emotions of growing up with an unusual family structure. Most importantly, Sophie had learned that families could be chosen as well as inherited, and that the most important relationships were those built on mutual respect, honesty, and genuine care for each other's well-being. "Grandma Eleanor," Sophie said now, looking up from her essay, "do you ever regret how everything happened? Do you wish it could have been different?" It was a question she asked periodically, usually when she was processing some new understanding about the complexity of our situation. I'd learned to answer her honestly while also acknowledging the pain inherent in our family's destruction. "Sophie, I regret that your parents made the choices they made. I regret that you had to grow up seeing adults you trusted behave badly. I regret that we couldn't all find a way to be honest with each other before things got so destructive." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "But I don't regret protecting us from their manipulation. I don't regret demonstrating that actions have consequences. I don't regret showing you that sometimes you have to choose difficult truth over comfortable lies. And I especially don't regret the life we've built together. Even though it meant losing them." "Sophie, we didn't lose them. We discovered who they really were. There's a difference between losing people and learning the truth about people." She nodded and returned to her essay, apparently satisfied with my answer. But I sat there thinking about how our story had evolved over 5 years from a tale of betrayal and revenge to something more complex and ultimately more hopeful. Yes, I'd lost the daughter I thought I had. Yes, I'd discovered that 20 years of what I'd believed was generous family love had actually been systematic manipulation. Yes, I'd been forced to completely reconstruct my understanding of the most important relationships in my life. But I'd also gained something invaluable: clarity about my own worth, strength I didn't know I possessed, and a relationship with my granddaughter that was built on honesty instead of obligation. I'd learned that being alone with your integrity intact was infinitely better than being surrounded by people who saw your love as a weakness to exploit. I'd discovered that protecting vulnerable people, including myself, was worth the cost of disappointing people who thought family loyalty meant accepting abuse. Most importantly, I'd shown Sophie that women don't have to be victims, that elderly people don't have to be easy targets, and that love should make you stronger, not more vulnerable to exploitation. That evening, as Sophie finished her homework and I prepared dinner in the kitchen where this whole story had begun, I thought about the 13-year-old girl working at our table. She was confident, articulate, morally clear, and unafraid to ask difficult questions or stand up for what she believed was right. She'd grown up seeing that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who refuse to let you get away with hurting others. She'd learned that honesty was more valuable than peace, that consequences were more important than forgiveness, and that real love never required accepting harmful behavior. These weren't lessons I'd planned to teach her, but they were lessons that had emerged from the most difficult period of both our lives. And watching her apply these lessons to her friendships, her school relationships, and her understanding of the world around her, I knew they would serve her well for the rest of her life. Grandma Eleanor, Sophie called from the table, I finished my essay. Do you want to hear it? I'd love to hear it, sweetheart. She cleared her throat and began reading in the confident voice of a young woman who'd learned to speak truth fearlessly. The person who most influenced my life is my grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell. When I was 8 years old, my parents tried to steal her inheritance, and instead of letting them get away with it, she fought back. She taught me that love doesn't mean accepting bad behavior, that family doesn't mean loyalty without honesty, and that sometimes protecting yourself and others requires making very difficult choices. As Sophie read her essay about courage, honesty, and the complicated nature of family love, I realized that our story had come full circle. What had begun with a child's innocent revelation about adult betrayal had become a lesson in integrity that would guide her for the rest of her life. If you've stayed with our story to the end, if you've been watching from wherever you are in the world, then you know that sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the foundation for the most important lessons. Hit that subscribe button one more time and check that description box below, because stories like ours matter. They matter because they show that love should make you stronger, not more vulnerable. They matter because they demonstrate that age doesn't mean defenseless, and family doesn't mean unconditional acceptance of harmful behavior. They matter because they prove that sometimes, when everything falls apart, you discover that you're stronger than you ever imagined possible. And sometimes, that strength is exactly what the people you love most need you to find. Sophie finished reading her essay and looked at me expectantly. What do you think? I think, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand, that you understand the most important lesson of all. That real love protects people, even when that protection is difficult or unpopular or requires standing up to the very people who are supposed to love you back. Is that what you did for me? That's what we did for each other, sweetheart. We chose truth over comfort, honesty over peace, and protection over pretense. And look what we built from the wreckage. I gestured around our kitchen, our home, our life that had been constructed from the ashes of betrayal and rebuilt on a foundation of trust, respect, and authentic love. We built something real, Sophie. Something honest. Something that will last. She smiled and squeezed my hand. I love you, Grandma Eleanor. I love you too, baby girl. More than you'll ever know. And in that moment, sitting in the kitchen where this whole story began, I realized that Jessica had been wrong about one thing all those years ago. I wouldn't die alone in a nursing home with no family and no visitors. I would live surrounded by people who loved me honestly, who respected my strength, and who understood that real family is built on truth rather than genetics. I would live knowing that I'd protected the people who mattered most, taught the lessons that needed teaching, and left a legacy of courage instead of victimhood. I would live knowing that sometimes, the most important battles are the ones you never wanted to fight, and the most important victories are the ones that cost you everything you thought you wanted in order to give you everything you actually needed. That's enough for any life. More than enough. That's everything. Thank you for staying with Eleanor and Sophie's story from beginning to end. If this story resonated with you, please share it with others who might need to hear that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, that family love should make you stronger, not more vulnerable, and that sometimes the most difficult choices lead to the most authentic life. Check the description below for more stories about courage, resilience, and the power of choosing truth over comfort.